Picture yourself as a European colonist in the 1500s, staring at strange alien foods that natives claim are edible, while every fiber of your being screams that these must be the devil's own harvest. Today we're diving deep into 6 American foods that Europeans were absolutely convinced were witches' cuisine. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand exactly why our ancestors would rather starve than take a single bite of what we now consider everyday ingredients. Observe how the crimson flesh of the tomato glistened like fresh blood in the morning sun, its skin taut and unnatural. Spanish conquistadors first encountered these love apples in Aztec markets around 1519, where they watched indigenous people consume them without apparent harm. Yet European physicians immediately declared them poisonous, noting how the fruit's deep red color matched the hue of freshly spilled blood. The acidic juice would corrode silver plates, further confirming their suspicions that Satan himself had crafted this deceptive fruit. Wealthy Europeans who dared taste tomatoes often fell violently ill, not knowing that their lead-glazed pewter dishes were leaching poison into the acidic fruit. The tomato's curse seemed real. The morning mist carried whispers of dark magic through colonial settlements. Repair the eerie way potatoes emerged from the dark earth like pale, deformed fingers, clawing their way to the surface. When Spanish explorers brought these tubers from Peru in 1570, European peasants recoiled in horror at their grotesque appearance. The potato's eyes seemed to stare accusingly, while its knobby, irregular shape resembled diseased flesh or cursed stones. French farmers refused to plant them, believing the devil's vegetables would corrupt their souls. Protestant ministers preached that since potatoes weren't mentioned in the Bible, they must be Satan's creation. The underground growth pattern itself seemed unnatural. God's food grew toward heaven, not in the bowels of hell. Entire communities developed mysterious ailments after consuming green potatoes, which contained toxic solanine alkaloids. And the earth seemed to reject them too. Sinter, the oppressive weight of superstition, as corn kernels burst and transformed in iron pots over crackling fires. Native Americans had cultivated maize for over 9,000 years, but Europeans arriving in 1492 witnessed something that defied their understanding of natural law. Christopher Columbus himself noted the strange grain that indigenous peoples consumed, describing how it exploded when heated, seemingly possessed by supernatural forces. The corn's ability to multiply exponentially from a single kernel appeared to violate God's natural order. European settlers observed how eating corn as a primary food source caused pellagra, a disease that produced skin lesions, dementia, and death, clear evidence of the grain's cursed nature. Italian peasants called it Turkish grain, believing it carried the plague from heathen lands. The very air seemed to thicken with unnatural dread. Acute the sinister rustle of tobacco leaves as they dried in shadowy barns, their narcotic properties whispering promises of addiction and spiritual corruption. When Europeans first witnessed Taino shamans smoking tobacco in 1492, they watched in horror as men deliberately inhaled smoke and fell into trance-like states. Spanish missionaries immediately identified this as communion with demons, noting how the plant induced visions and altered consciousness. The tobacco's heart-shaped leaves seemed to mock Christian symbolism, while its ability to create physical dependency suggested supernatural possession. By 1604, King James I of England published a counterblast to tobacco, declaring it a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. Medical texts described tobacco users as possessed by evil spirits, their souls gradually consumed by the demon plant. The smoke carried more than just scent. Imagine the revulsion that swept through European courts when chocolate arrived as a bitter, foamy drink mixed with chili peppers and consumed during Aztec religious ceremonies. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés witnessed Montezuma II consuming up to 50 golden goblets of chocolate daily in 1519, convinced he was observing a satanic ritual. The cacao bean's botanical name, Theobroma, meaning food of the gods, only confirmed European suspicions that chocolate was an offering to pagan deities. Catholic monks debated whether consuming chocolate broke religious fasts, as its stimulating properties seemed to awaken carnal desires. The drink's dark color resembled dried blood, while its bitter taste suggested poison. European physicians warned that chocolate heated the blood and inspired lustful thoughts, making it unsuitable for virtuous Christians. Women who consumed chocolate were particularly suspect, as the stimulating effects were considered evidence of witchcraft. The shadows of ancient rituals seemed to dance in every cup. Contemplate how the bright orange flesh of sweet potatoes glowed with an almost supernatural luminescence when roasted over open flames. Columbus encountered these tubers in 1492, but European settlers remained deeply suspicious of their unnatural sweetness and vivid color. Unlike regular potatoes, sweet potatoes produced colorful flowers and heart-shaped leaves that seemed too perfect, too seductive to be God's creation. The vegetable's ability to sprout and grow from its own flesh appeared to violate natural law. It seemed to resurrect itself endlessly. Protestant reformers preached that sweet potatoes' sensual sweetness was designed to tempt the faithful away from righteous suffering. Spanish colonists noted how indigenous peoples consumed sweet potatoes during fertility ceremonies, further confirming their aphrodisiac and therefore demonic properties. The very sweetness felt like temptation incarnate. Visualize the terror that gripped European settlers when they first witnessed indigenous peoples consuming beans that exploded violently when heated. Native Americans had domesticated common beans over 7,000 years ago, but European observers interpreted their cooking methods as evidence of supernatural forces at work. The beans' ability to double in size when soaked seemed like dark magic, while their tendency to cause flatulence was viewed as the devil's attempt to corrupt human dignity. Spanish missionaries noted how beans were offered to indigenous gods during harvest ceremonies, convinced they were witnessing satanic worship. The variety of colors, blood red, deep purple, mottled black, suggested corruption and evil influence. European physicians warned that beans caused melancholy and disturbed the four humors, leading to spiritual imbalance. The very act of eating them felt like a pact with darkness. Observe carefully how vanilla orchids grew in mysterious, serpentine patterns up jungle trees, their flowers blooming for only a single day before withering away. When Spanish conquistadors encountered vanilla in Montezuma's chocolate in 1519, they witnessed what appeared to be botanical witchcraft. The orchid family itself was associated with sexuality and forbidden knowledge, as these flowers resembled human reproductive organs. Vanilla's intoxicating fragrance seemed designed to bewitch the senses, while its complex pollination process, requiring specific insects and precise timing, suggested supernatural intervention. European botanists couldn't successfully cultivate vanilla for over 300 years, convinced the plant was cursed to grow only in heathen lands. The spice's ability to enhance other flavors, while remaining almost invisible, seemed like culinary sorcery. If you're starting to see why our ancestors lived in constant fear of these everyday foods, subscribe to the channel and share this journey through history's strangest food phobias, because the deeper we dig into colonial fears, the more we understand how superstition shaped entire civilizations. The very air in those tropical forests pulsed with ancient secrets. Recognize the profound terror that consumed European minds when they encountered indigenous peoples consuming raw and fermented versions of these supposedly cursed foods. Archaeological evidence from the Tehuacan Valley shows that hunter-gatherers were cultivating these crops as early as 8000 BCE, long before European civilization even existed. Spanish chroniclers documented elaborate indigenous agricultural systems that seemed impossibly sophisticated, leading them to conclude that supernatural forces guided native farming. The fact that indigenous populations thrived on these foods, while Europeans sickened, only reinforced beliefs about racial superiority and divine providence. Colonial physicians developed elaborate theories about how different races possessed different spiritual constitutions, with Europeans being too pure and godly to safely consume demonic foods. The weight of centuries pressed down on every meal. Avali, how European botanical knowledge based entirely on Mediterranean and Northern European plants proved utterly inadequate for understanding New World crops. The doctrine of signatures, which taught that God created plants to resemble their medicinal uses, offered no guidance for these alien species. Tomatoes' red color suggested they would cause bleeding disorders, while potatoes' pallor indicated they would drain life force. The absence of these plants in classical texts by Dioscorides, Galen, and Pliny the Elder was taken as proof of their unnatural origins. European universities wouldn't officially study New World botany until the 18th century, leaving colonists to rely on superstition and fear. The first botanical gardens that attempted to cultivate American crops were often destroyed by mobs convinced they were harboring evil influences. Every green leaf whispered of forbidden knowledge. Perceber the economic forces that prolonged European resistance to American foods. As established trade routes and agricultural systems created powerful interests opposed to dietary change. The Mediterranean diet, centered on wheat, wine, and olive oil, represented not just nutrition, but cultural identity and religious symbolism. Introducing American crops threatened the livelihood of European grain merchants, vineyard owners, and established farming communities. The Catholic Church's association of bread and wine with the Eucharist made any dietary changes seem theologically dangerous. Spanish colonial policies actually prohibited the cultivation of certain American crops in Europe to maintain colonial dependencies. It took over 2 centuries for potatoes to gain acceptance. In Ireland, and even longer in France and Germany, the machinery of tradition ground forward with inexorable force. Record how indigenous preparation methods, which had evolved over millennia to neutralize toxins and maximize nutrition, were dismissed as primitive superstition by European colonists. Native Americans knew to process corn with lime to prevent pellagra, to avoid green potatoes to prevent poisoning, and to ferment beans to improve digestibility. But European arrogance prevented them from learning these crucial techniques, leading to actual illness and death that seemed to confirm their worst fears. Spanish missionaries systematically destroyed indigenous agricultural knowledge, viewing it as connected to pagan religious practices. The loss of this wisdom created a tragic cycle where Europeans continued to poison themselves with improper food preparation while blaming the foods themselves for their supernatural malevolence. Ancient wisdom dissolved like morning mist before the rising sun of conquest. Entender, the profound psychological impact of encountering an entire continent of unfamiliar foods, each one a reminder of European ignorance and vulnerability in the New World. Colonial diaries reveal deep anxiety about food safety, with settlers often preferring starvation to consuming indigenous crops. The fear of being slowly poisoned by demon foods created a parallel terror to concerns about indigenous peoples themselves being agents of Satan. European identity was deeply tied to familiar foods, bread, wine, familiar vegetables, and abandoning these for strange New World crops felt like abandoning Christianity itself. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on biblical literalism made any food not mentioned in Scripture automatically suspect. Catholic doctrine about transubstantiation made bread sacred, relegating corn-based foods to the realm of the profane. The very foundations of European identity trembled with each exotic bite. Analyze how colonial medicine reinforced food superstitions through the theory of the 4 humors, which taught that foods possessed inherent spiritual and physical properties. European physicians classified American crops according to their supposed effects on blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, usually concluding they were excessively hot, cold, wet, or dry for European constitutions. The doctrine taught that each race possessed different humoral balances, making foods safe for indigenous peoples potentially deadly for Europeans. Medical texts describe tomatoes as excessively cold and moist, potatoes as melancholic and earthbound, and chocolate as dangerously heating to the blood. These classifications weren't just medical opinions, they were theological statements about the natural order of creation and European spiritual superiority. The weight of ancient Greek medical theory pressed down on every colonial kitchen. Confront the ultimate irony that many of these supposedly demonic foods would eventually become the foundation of European cuisine and global agriculture. Potatoes prevented famines across northern Europe by the 18th century, supporting population explosions that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Tomatoes became central to Italian cuisine, corn-fed livestock across Eastern Europe, and chocolate generated massive wealth for European colonial powers. The same foods that terrified 16th century settlers as witches' brew became the economic foundation of European expansion and prosperity. By 1750, European populations that had adopted American crops were dramatically larger and healthier than those that hadn't. The spiritual terror gradually gave way to economic necessity, but only after centuries of suffering caused by superstitious resistance. History's greatest joke was written in kernels of corn and slices of tomato. Descubra how the gradual acceptance of these foods required nothing less than a fundamental transformation of European consciousness about nature, divine providence, and cultural superiority. The Enlightenment's emphasis on empirical observation slowly undermined supernatural explanations for agricultural phenomena, while colonial economics made American crops too valuable to ignore. French physiocrats like Antoine-Augustin Parmentier literally had to trick peasants into accepting potatoes by posting armed guards around potato fields during the day, then withdrawing them at night, so curious villagers would steal and plant the supposedly valuable crops. The scientific revolution's mechanistic worldview gradually replaced supernatural explanations, but the transition took over 2 centuries and required overcoming deeply ingrained religious and cultural prejudices. The very concept of progress was measured in slowly changing dinner plates. Conclua that what we casually consume today as pizza sauce, French fries, chocolate, and morning coffee were once considered literal food of the devil by our ancestors, feared with the same intensity that medieval Europeans feared witches, demons, and the plague itself. These 6 foods, tomatoes, potatoes, corn, tobacco, chocolate, and beans, represented not just new nutrition, but a complete challenge to European understanding of divine order, racial hierarchy, and spiritual purity. The terror they inspired reveals how deeply food connects to identity, survival, and faith. When European colonists looked at indigenous peoples thriving on these crops, they saw not agricultural wisdom but evidence of supernatural corruption. The centuries-long struggle to accept American foods was really a struggle to accept that European knowledge was incomplete, that other cultures possessed valuable wisdom, and that the New World offered not just gold and territory, but entirely new ways of living and eating. Can you imagine living in such constant fear of your next meal, where every bite might be your last dance with the devil himself? Share your thoughts in the comments below about which of these foods you couldn't live without, and consider how many of your daily meals would have been impossible in medieval Europe.